Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to patch 3.25 teaser season. Today, we're going to be discussing the day after the patch notes. Some of the things that I've picked up by having a deep dive into the patch notes that were discussed a little bit in yesterday's epic live stream where we discussed the patch notes for something like 7 hours. If you want to see the whole live stream, I'll put a link to it in the description of this video and it'll be up on screen during the last 20 seconds. But I understand a lot of people don't have 7.25 hours to sit through an entire patch notes discussion, and you just want the highlights. And that's what this video is about. We're going to be looking at things that got buffed, and also some new builds that might be possible as a result of changes in these patch notes, or potentially modifications you might fit into existing builds. We're going to start though by talking about Perfect Agony. Perfect Agony is getting completely reworked. All the existing text on this keystone is being deleted. You might not even know what this keystone used to do. If that's the case, don't worry about it. You don't need to know because it's doing something else now. But what this keystone is all about is doing damage with ailments that you inflict through critical strikes. All the old text on this keystone is being deleted and the new text is going to read. It now causes damage over time multiplier for ailments to be equal to your critical strike multiplier, causes critical strikes to not deal extra damage, and makes it so non-critical strikes cannot inflict ailments. This is complex, so let's break it down. Firstly, this is going to cause you to have a bad day if you have less than 100% critical strike chance. The reason for this is you're playing a build that invests heavily in critical strike damage scaling and in ailment scaling, and you're not going to be getting any benefits of either of those when you non-critically hit. For that reason, you really want to have 100% critical strike chance in order to allocate Perfect Agony, and you probably don't want to level with this setup, outside a couple of specialized setups that use ambush in order to guarantee critical hits with various strikes. So keep that in mind. But once you do get to like level 70 or so on an assassin, or perhaps level 85 on other builds, you can definitely respec into a very heavy critical strike focus, critical strikes, power charges, crit multi, all that good stuff. But then also pick up Perfect Agony and start doing a lot of damage with poison, bleed, or ignite, whichever is your preference. It causes damage over time multiplier for ailments to be equal to your critical strike multiplier. This is massive. This means that if your critical strike multiplier is 470%, then your damage over time multiplier for ailments is equal to 470%. Notice the whole is equal to type text that's here. This is very similar to what's found on Badge of the Brotherhood. With Badge of the Brotherhood, it overwrites your maximum frenzy charges to be equal to your maximum power charges. What this means is that +1 maximum frenzy charges is a dead stat on your character, but +1 maximum power charges gives you the benefit to both stats. In the context of Perfect Agony, what this means is that increases in critical strike multiplier increase both critical strike multiplier and dot multi for ailments, but other sources of dot multi for ailments, or less restrictive stats like generic dot multi or fire dot multi if you're ignite or chaos dot multi, they're just going to do nothing. So this is overriding one stat with another. Why does this matter? Well, the key reason is that it's much harder to get damage over time multiplier for ailments than it is to get critical strike multiplier. You can get much more of the latter. Let's talk about two ways that you can get a lot of damage over time multiplier for ailments. Let's start with the one that is suitable on a budget. This would be how you would start a character that's using Perfect Agony, although this is something you will get rid of, because this is an item that's all about mediocrity. If you're not yet mediocre, it brings you up to being mediocre, but if you're already well beyond mediocre, then it's going to pull you down to mediocrity. This is Maligaro's Virtuosity. These sets of gloves overwrite your critical strike multiplier with the number 300%. So this is overwriting dot multi for ailments on your character with the number 300%. It has no drawback to critical strike chance. In fact, it provides a bunch of global crit on it. In 3.24, these gloves were tier 3 rarity, which is about 6 to 8 times as rare as the very most common unique items in the game, and they're mostly regarded as complete trash by players, and as a result, they're able to be had pretty cheaply. And while a divination card for them is not super common, it's also not super rare, and it's certainly not prized, very easy to pick up in trade, and very accessible if you're playing in solo self-found as well. Now, that's the thing you would use to get started on a character. Your critical strike multiplier is 300%, is going to be a millstone around your neck at one point, once you start having the ability to scale critical strike multiplier higher than that. Plus, you might not be at 100% critical strike chance, you might be well past it. When you reach this point, Marylene's Fallacy is the answer. Get rid of those gloves, they're holding you down at this point. Marylene's Fallacy is what you want. This item has 40% less critical strike chance on it. This is a very severe drawback. Instead of needing 100% critical strike chance, you start needing like 166.7%. Also known as ouch. However, in exchange for this, you can get up to 240% global critical strike multiplier, which becomes up to 240% universal damage over time multiplier for ailments. This amulet is going to be the best in slot damage amulet by an absolutely unbelievable amount on any build that is doing poison, bleed, or ignite with critical strikes and that is using Perfect Agony in order to do this. However, while we're talking about Marylene's Fallacy, there is one very important thing we need to talk about. We've already mentioned that it's got a drawback, 40% less critical strike chance. And this is a meaningful drawback, it's a painful drawback. This drawback's magnitude gets increased when you have quality on the item. If you have 3% or more critical strike quality on this item, then that 40% less critical strike chance will tick up to between 41 and 48%. That's going to be something that may transform other requirements on your build, and it may end up not being worth going with that extra quality. The reason that I raise this though in particular is that Marylene's Fallacy is not a particularly expensive item in the 3.24 trade league. Who knows what it'll be like in 3.25, maybe Grinding Gear Games decide it's time for it to be rare and they put it up to tier 1 rarity, maybe it stays in tier 3 rarity where it is now, maybe it becomes more common and it's tier 5. It's certainly moved around a fair bit over time, so I'm not going to make any predictions there. But if they do decide to leave it in tier 3 rarity, it's a sort of item that people are often going to corrupt, because 20 to 30 intelligence is a kind of meh implicit, and there are much better ones that are available in the pool of Val implicits that exist on the amulet slot. So with that in mind, Marylene's Fallacy can be a bit tricky. You're going to want an exact amount of quality on it. Maybe you've worked out that with your character set up the way that it is, 12% is the most quality you can handle, and then any more than that is going to cause your critical strike chance to fall under 100% effective crit chance. If that happens and you're seeking your own premium corrupt on it, you might find that it's quite difficult to get the exact quality level that you want on a perfectly rolled Marylene's Fallacy. Anyways, that's all getting into min-maxing. The key thing is, keep this item in mind. It's going to be really good however you decide to min-max it. Now, I think that the most sensible way in order to build around Perfect Agony is probably going to be poison, but that is far from the only thing you can do. If you want a hipster option, you could consider Cold Snap of Power, which has a very high base critical strike chance, and inflicting Ignite with that skill. If you want a complete meme option, and I definitely don't advocate playing this if you want to be successful, this is something just for the memes, then you could play Voltaxic Burst Poison as something completely ridiculous, but that does have plenty of synergy with this setup. Now, when we want to talk about potential late game options to enhance this build even further, Impossible Escape is a unique item that drops from the Uber Maven, and it drops about 1/3 of the time you kill her. Passives in radius of Keystone, and that Keystone can be any Keystone, can be allocated without being connected to your tree. Now, what would happen if we had Acrobatics as the Keystone here? Well, it looks like, and I'm not going to promise this, this is just the way that it looks looking at the current passive tree setup here, it looks like an Acrobatics Impossible Escape will reach to Perfect Agony in 3.25. The other thing is that not only are you able to allocate Perfect Agony without being anywhere near it on the passive tree, you're also able, with this Acrobatics Impossible Escape, to pick up a number of other premium nodes that are right nearby. For example, the entire Inveterate spell suppression cluster, this is really strong. It's one of the best spell suppression options on the entire tree, and it's something that you can pick up from Acrobatics here. Additionally, you've got this entire damage projection cluster, piercing shots, split shot, and also trick shot. You probably don't want all three of these, but you probably do want one of them, especially if you're playing some sort of projectile-based occultist build, or potentially projectile-based Inquisitor build, which comes nowhere near this area of the passive tree, but needs to pick up Perfect Agony somehow, and also, while it's picking up Perfect Agony, may as well pick up some other useful mechanics as well. So that's a potential very late game option that would require you to do a thorough respec in order to use it, because you're going to totally transform the way that your tree is connected, but there is definitely a lot of power to be had from doing that. The other thing that I will say though is that this is all based upon a mock-up of what it would look like if you had the Acrobatics Impossible Escape configured, and it's entirely possible that that mock-up is just a little bit wrong, and Inveterate only just looks like it fits in, likewise Perfect Agony only just looks like it fits in, and Trick Shot is only in by a few millimeters, so it is possible that some of these distances are just a smidgen wrong, and that these end up not being quite inside this circle. If that's the case, you'll definitely need to reassess this plan, but for now, I would say keep this in mind as something to reconfirm later, because if it works, it's going to be really good, and I think it does work. I'm just not 100% sure. Anyway, that's the first big winner, Perfect Agony. The second big winner that I want to talk about is armor as a defensive layer. One of the most important changes that's been taking place in patch 3.25 is the rare monster modifier that previously caused the monster to overwhelm 30% physical damage reduction, now instead causes the monster to apply the crushed debuff on hit. What the crushed debuff does, it's scary, but the crushed debuff does not necessarily cause you to just automatically fall over dead, like being slammed by something with 30% phys overwhelm did. The crushed debuff causes you to have 15% reduced physical damage reduction for the period that that debuff is active. So let's imagine the best case scenario. You're hit by a monster and you've got a staggering amount of armor. Let's say you've got 2 million armor, and that means that the monster's hit does 90% less damage. Under the old system, their first hit dealt 40% of base damage because it was overwhelming 30% of your PDR, and so it was hitting you as though you had only 60% physical damage reduction. Now, the first hit is going to hit you for only 10% of its base damage because your 90% mitigation from armor is going to be entirely effective against it. After that, the crush debuff will be on your character, and that means the next hit that monster lands on you will deal 25% of base damage. But it's very important to remember that you're playing an armor character here. What does an armor character have? It almost certainly has cast when damage taken linked to Molten Shell. So as long as you have sufficient mana or life to pay for the cost of Molten Shell going off, which is a non-trivial cost, as long as that happens when the first hit comes in, then you do suffer that crush debuff, but you also get Molten Shell up. So you've got an ablative shield that's going to cause many thousands of damage to bounce off you. In short, the big difference from the old behavior is that where in the old behavior, the monster just one-shot you, now you get a warning hit. That warning hit causes your cast when damage taken Molten Shell to go off, and now suddenly you're in danger. You've got the crush debuff on you, the monster and potentially even its allies are now hitting you as though you had 15% reduced physical damage reduction, but you're in a much better place to survive long enough to realize something is wrong and get out of the way. So that's the reason that armor as a defensive layer is looking much better than it was in the past. A couple of things you might want to consider using in conjunction with armor these days. The Formless Flame. I have loved this item for a while, but it was never good enough in an era where monsters could overwhelm 30% physical damage reduction. It was really, really good until you came across one of those monsters, and then your defenses turned to paper and you went splat. The Formless Flame is looking a lot better. Now this goes on a chieftain, and it goes on a chieftain that uses a very, very high armor chest piece. This could be one of the new rares that's been buffed in 3.25, or it could be the Brass Dome. The chieftain tends to stack a lot of fire resistance anyway, and each 2 points of fire resistance you get on gear will grant you 1 point of lightning resistance and 1 point of cold resistance, which means you don't need to really worry about those stats at all. It will also grant you 2 flat life recovery because you're certain to take 1 fire mastery in order to get that particular mastery, and it will provide you 2% increased global armor on your entire character. This ends up being really strong, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this combination starting to see some use. Potentially people will use the Formless Flame and Brass Dome earlier on in progression, but then as their character gets stronger, they'll upgrade from the Brass Dome to something that's better. Now those of you that have ever played a classic armor stacker build may be familiar with the Grasping Mail, an unusual crafting base that comes out of certain breach content. This can get that special mod that is found on the Formless Flame, although it can't be rolled on it, it has to drop with that mod on it, kind of like an incursion item. The problem with the Grasping Mail, and the reason I'm not going to advocate it, is that 3.25 is shifting around where you get your flat armor and flat evasion from. In 3.24, you can get huge gobs of these on the auras Determination and Grace. In 3.25, those auras are being nerfed, and that power is being given back in terms of higher base armor stats on the new top armor pieces that are available. However, Grasping Mail is not getting a commensurate buff, and as a result, I think it's going to fall behind the option of having a real chest piece and then using the Formless Flame instead. Of course, there'll definitely be ways that you can make Grasping Mails work. They're not going to be dumpster tier or anything. I just don't think that they're going to be your first port of call. This might be something that you consider as a very, 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 very late game upgrade once you outgrow the Formless Flame entirely. There are other options as well if you're interested in getting armor on your character. Iron Reflexes has actually moved a little bit this patch, but it's still in fundamentally the same area of the passive tree, and it converts all of your evasion rating to armor. If you're willing to spec Iron Reflexes, there's a couple of options that you've got. I want to start by mentioning the Perfect Form, which drops either from Uber Tull or from using a Blessing that drops from regular Tull to upgrade the Snowblind Grace. The Perfect Form is a dangerous item. It grants you the Acrobatics keystone, which removes spell suppression's usual effect and transforms it into spell dodge. Broadly speaking, players prefer spell suppression to spell dodge, and as a result, the Perfect Form can be a fairly risky item to use. Honestly, I think this would be a fantastic item if it had a few hundred ward on it, but it does not have that few hundred ward, and it will make you a little bit more susceptible to one-shots. However, if you're okay with occasionally dying to spells, then the Perfect Form in conjunction with the Iron Reflexes keystone will provide you with quite a bunch of defense. However, while we're on the topic of Perfect Form, there is a Replica Perfect Form, and it does not have Acrobatics on it. Replica Perfect Form is something that I think is really worth your while considering. It has this evasion rating is increased by overcapped cold resistance, so just like regular Perfect Form, it can give you a staggering amount of evasion, which can then get converted into armor on your character. But on top of that, Replica Perfect Form also provides you some chance to block attack damage, and it provides you Versatile Combatant, which is being buffed in 3.25. Versatile Combatant turns wasted excessive attack block into spell block instead, and it got buffed considerably in this patch, where previously its drawback was 25% reduction to the maximum chance to block attack and spell damage, and that was generally too much for it to be good. It's now only 10% to each of those. So whilst we started out talking about Perfect Form, it's actually Replica Perfect Form that's the one you probably want to use. Replica Perfect Form in 3.24 was a tier 3 rarity unique out of Heist, which is not staggeringly rare, but it's definitely not common either. It's the same rarity as Replica Atziri's Foible, Replica Tullfall, Replica Cold Iron Point, and several other items. So that's another item that you might want to consider using if you're interested in stacking a lot of armor on your character in conjunction with the use of Iron Reflexes. Remember, if you are using Iron Reflexes, both Grace and Determination will boost your ultimate armor. So the third thing I wanted to call out is Hexblast Mines. Why does this benefit from the patch? Well, there are two main reasons. The first one is that it wasn't nerfed and it was already really good. This was on a lot of people's radar as something that might get hit really hard with the nerf bat, and it has not been hit really hard with the nerf bat. It's got a very tiny change to its performance at gem levels 1, 2, 3, up to about 15 or so. That's entirely manageable and is nothing serious. The second thing though is that usually the best in slot helmet for a Hexblast Miner build is the Sandstorm Visage, and this item is getting buffed in 3.25. It's not a direct buff, the stats on the item aren't changing, and in fact it's going to be made rarer to compensate for the indirect buff it's getting, but the real change is that various wands are going to have a base critical strike chance of 10%. Now this is the wand as an attack item, but if you're using Sandstorm Visage, then the base spell critical strike chance of your spells, including Hexblast, goes up from 4%. This is completely overwritten by the local critical strike chance of your main-handed weapon, and that is now 10% base, but you can do much higher than 10% because you can get a local crit mod on it, and you can also get a Harvest enchantment on it that will provide even more on top of that. So, Sandstorm Visage is getting an indirect buff, and that's going to make the Hexblast Miner builds better than they were in the past, once you get deep into endgame and you can afford what might be a quite expensive helmet in this league. Or of course, you could always go farm your own because you are playing the preeminent Sanctum Runner build. So, we were talking about changes to wands. Why don't we talk about the fourth big winner of this patch notes, which is wand attack builds. This is builds that make direct attacks with wands as ranged weapons. Now I'm just going to take one example of a wand here, not necessarily the one that you would use on a wand attack build, and that is the Prophecy wand. And this is going from 1.2 attacks per second baseline up to 1.4. This is a buff. This is about a 15% buff to the amount of damage that a wand attack build is going to do. Then on top of that, we also have that critical strike improvement from 8% up to 10%. So you're getting 25% more critical strikes than you used to get, or more realistically, if you are at endgame, you're probably trying to get max critical strike chance, which means that you just need less investment in order to do that, and you can then reinvest those points somewhere else. You've got that approximately 15-16% more attack speed, and then on top of that, Kinetic Blast, the gem, is going from 100% base attack speed to 115% base attack speed, so that's another 15% more multiplier to your attack speed. And on top of that, it's also getting another very useful line of text. Increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attack damage from this skill at 200% of their value. Essentially, Kinetic Blast is getting gigabuffed. Power Siphon is getting gigabuffed. A whole bunch of these wand attack skills are getting big buffs, and they're getting them from multiple different sections of the patch notes at once. The key thing here though is that these buffs stack, and they stack multiplicatively, and so this may just be everything that's needed for these builds that have been out of the meta for a long time to make a massive, massive, massive comeback. Okay, so the fifth thing I wanted to call out here is Holy Relic builds, specifically Holy Relic of Conviction builds. There are no changes in the patch notes to Holy Relic of Conviction. This is a very, very big deal because this was one of those builds that a lot of people thought had a fairly high chance of getting nerfed going into the patch notes. It was a very, very high performer in tier 16 and 17 maps last league, and it was something that was a very good league starter choice, even if it wasn't really developed for a little while. Now, it is entirely possible that the helmet that these builds use may be rarer than it was in the past, but even if that's the case, the build will function without it, and then it becomes an aspirational upgrade rather than one of the first upgrades that you ever get. It's still going to be incredibly good. Ultimately, Holy Relic builds are still in a phenomenal place, and that makes them a winner of these patch notes because a lot of people did expect that there was a good chance they'd get nerfed. The next thing I wanted to call out as a potential big winner in these patch notes is Beyond as a mechanic, and potentially as a mechanic to use quite early in the league. Now, there's a couple of changes here that matter. The first one is the Beyond Scarab of the Invasion now is going to work with rare monsters as well. So rare monsters as well as unique monsters will cause additional Beyond portals to spawn, which if you get enough of them in one place will cause the various Beyond packs to spawn, which are the main reason that you care about this mechanic. So, one of the Scarabs got better. So that particular Scarab goes from terrible to reasonable. But the synergies between Beyond Scarab of the Invasion and Abyss as a mechanic, which has a lot of rare monsters, or the Scarab of Adversaries, which also adds a lot of rare monsters to maps, that's not the main reason that I want to talk about Beyond. The main reason I want to talk about Beyond is something that is written to look like a nerf. And that is the nerfs to Tainted Armorer's Scraps and Tainted Blacksmith's Whetstones. These are going to be objectively worse in patch 3.25 than they were in the past. But they're also going to be rarer, and that's important, because there's nothing here indicating that tainted currency drops will decrease, only that the relative abundance of Tainted Armorer's Scraps and Tainted Whetstones will decrease relative to everything else in the pool. So, my reading of what's going on here is that this is going to mean more Tainted Jeweler's Orbs will drop, more Tainted Fusing Orbs will drop, more Tainted Chromatic Orbs will drop, more Tainted Mythic Orbs will drop, and then there's the three rare ones, Tainted Chaos, Tainted Exalt, and Tainted Divine Teardrop, which are still going to be really rare, but will still benefit if the Tainted Armorer's Scraps and Whetstones take up a smaller piece of the pie. The other thing that makes me think that Beyond could be quite good early in the league is that there are some changes taking place to the Black Morrigan Beast. This beast is being removed from its existing Scarab, and it's being added into the core Einhar pool of beasts that can spawn. This is going to mean that there'll be a lot less of them available early on, and that's going to mean that people in Trade League in particular that are looking to 6-link an item will feel more dependent upon using Tainted Fusing Orbs early on. For that reason, there'll simultaneously be more demand for Tainted Fusings, but also they'll be easier to determinedly farm if you're interested in doing so, and that's why I think that Beyond is looking like it's in a pretty good place as a potential league start mechanic in 3.25, as long as your character comes online quickly and you can do the difficult encounters that are associated with the Beyond mechanic very early in progression. Next thing I wanted to call out is Ground Slam. This is the melee skill I'm probably most excited about just because it's something that's always felt really, really fun to use, but that has also not felt particularly strong in the past. Ground Slam has just felt like it's a little bit too weak, but it's getting a huge, huge, huge boost to the amount of damage that it does. Getting something like 95% more damage than it was doing before, and those numbers just feel like they're really high. As well as that, you've also got Vaal Ground Slam, which is going to be in a better place as the only Vaal skill that can be exerted, because there's a number of changes that make it easier to use Warcries for exerting skills. I don't think Warcries are in all that great a place overall, but they are better when they're used to exert skills, and that's going to work well with Ground Slam as well. There are other skills that get big buffs in melee as well. Ground Slam's just the one that sings out to me as a skill that's like, this has a lot of raw damage because it's got 49% more damage to targets that are close to you, and it's also got that really cool playstyle of being able to tap Vaal Ground Slam when you just really absolutely positively need everything around you stunned, so that you can use this as a get out of jail free card. You're in trouble, you tap Vaal Ground Slam, everything around you is stunned, you can now reposition, and then you can start attacking again. That's one of the things I really like about the playstyle. It wasn't quite good enough before, but the numbers seem to be good on it now, and I'm keen to see exactly how this goes in 3.25. And finally, I want to talk about the Eventuality Rod. The Eventuality Rod is getting a small change in this patch. It's going to get a buff to its critical strike chance. 7% becomes 8.3%. But this was already an exceptionally good crafting base. This was one of the best physical DPS weapons around already, and it's only going to get better. So firstly, that base crit is going from 7 to 8.3%. That's a pretty big deal. But secondly, +1 to maximum power charges and +1 to maximum endurance charges, as the implicit on this, is going to be far better in the new 3.25 environment, where endurance charges do something different to what they used to do. Endurance charges are no longer going to grant 4% to all elemental resistances on players and minions. Instead, they're going to grant 4% additional elemental damage reduction per endurance charge. The reason this matters is that 4% elemental resistances is a stat that, while it's useful, it's something you've got to get somewhere, it's pretty easy to get somewhere else on your character. But elemental damage reduction is just a flat less multiplier to the amount of elemental damage you're taking in most situations, and that is a really big deal. This is a stat that's hard to get anywhere else, and if you've got 75% maximum resistances and you go from 3 to 4 endurance charges on your character, that's like going from 78% max res to 79% in terms of the amount of durability that it will give you. But additionally, this isn't even affected by the 90% absolute cap on how much you can raise your elemental resistances by. Essentially, I think that it's going to be a lot better to have endurance charges at any realistic number in 3.25 than it's been in the past, and the Eventuality Rod gives you an additional maximum endurance charge whilst also having a very low opportunity cost because it's a pretty good weapon anyway. This is something that's widely used currently on Slayer Cyclone builds. I expect that will continue to be the case, but I also expect that people will start using the Eventuality Rod potentially on more and more melee builds. Additionally, +1 maximum power charges is always useful, but it just gets better now that the base crit on this is going from 7% to 8.3%. It means less investment is required in order to reach that all-important 100% critical strike cap. Anyways, that's my highlights of the patch notes from 3.25. There are definitely some nerfs in there as well, and those would be something that would fit into another video at some point, but hopefully that's given you some ideas of interactions that might be worth your while playing around with when the league start comes around in less than a week's time. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.